Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast.
Hello and welcome to Tiny in All That Air, the Philip Larkin Society podcast. My name is Lyn Lockwood and I'm a trustee of the Philip Larkin Society. And the aim of this podcast is to spread the word of Philip Larkin and his poetry. In this episode, we conclude our conversation with poet Kieron Winn. Kieron talks to us about Faith Healing, the poem by Philip Larkin. He also talks about the difficult but fascinating process of writing poetry, and I yet again enthuse about concordances. We conclude this episode with Kieron reading two more poems from The Mortal Man. One of my favourites, The Duplicator, and a longer poem in two parts called Cornwall.
Well, the last time I was in Hull, I sat at Larkin's desk and I thought, oh, let's get this in the shot. And I moved it. I picked up this thing and I thought, Christ, I'm holding the toad. And I just moved the toad. Imagine if I dropped it. Imagine if I'd had a small heart attack at that moment. So I completely inappropriately picked up Larkin's toad and moved it across his desk. So I shouldn't be allowed. I'd probably been, whatever the opposite of the freedom of Hull is, I'd probably been given it.
I know you said that one of your favourite Larkin poems was Faith Healing.
Yes, I mean, it's not. I teach it a great deal as an example of partly Larkin's amazing ability to pack lines with detail that you might associate more with a novelist. I mean, I mainly teach 20-year-old Americans in Oxford, and it can be hard to get people to use their senses because they're so thinking about the intellect and concept. But if you look at how the poem begins, slowly the women file to where he stands, upright in rimless glasses, silver hair, dark suit, white collar. Now, if you look at that second line, upright in rimless glasses, silver hair, he's not wasting a single syllable of those 10. You've got his posture, you've got the rimless glasses, which I think must have been very snazzy and fashionable circa 1960. You've got his silver hair. He's a man of a certain age who may have a certain romantic appeal to some of these women. That is a highly efficient use of 10 syllables. I forget who made this poem, but of course Larkin's father was the treasurer for Coventry, and his job was not to waste public money. And I think someone has made this point, but I can't remember who. Larkin's poems are often like perfectly balanced account books. And nothing is wasted. There's not an ounce of fat on them, to mix my metaphors. Yes. Yeah. So and then the other thing that I think is, I don't think it's I think it's a very harrowing and tragic poem. When I say I like it, it's a terrible poem in the sense that you might refer to those Hopkins sonnets as terrible. It's about the terror of what might have been. But I also show the students I try to show the students how having done the work of observation, you can then you've earned the right to make the big universal statement at the end.
Yeah.
An immense slackening ache as when thawing the rigid landscape weeps. I mean, that kind of language would be terribly mushy in another context. But he's earned the right. He's kind of shown his working, he's shown that he's living in this world and using his senses.
Yeah, it always takes me as a very surprising subject matter for Larkin. I mean, he does write about religion from time to time, but this is something that's not something he's personally involved with. He's seen these images of these faith healers in America, but he's found something universal in that. Whereas I think I would have thought it would seem very foreign to him, these women falling at this faith healer's feet, and yet he takes that, he does see something very kind of moving, and like you say, very terrifying in it.
Yeah, I suppose it's a universal theme because it's not supposed to be about earthly love, and the fact that it's supposed to be about divine love maybe makes the universal aching for earthly love more apparent.
Yeah, and that line, that their thick tongues blort.
Oh, it's terrible, isn't it? I mean, when I say terrible, I'm sure everyone will realise, it's just it's so deeply sad is what I mean, yes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, and blort. I mean, that amazing. James Booth writes about this very well in his Life, Art and Love book on Larkin. But it's just the fact that a word like that, it's so placed and it goes so deep into the mind and the memory. And I think if you said to somebody who reads a lot of poetry, blort, it's only going to mean one poem. And how a lesser writer, probably including me, would have said blurt. And blurt, anyone can blurt, but to blort, gosh.
Yeah, and Larkin's a master of picking those words, isn't he? It's like Lobelia's for me.
Yes,
he doesn't use it anywhere else, and it just brings that image straight to life. And how do your students find it? Are they shocked by it?
I think they probably. You'd have to ask them, but I think they probably find it quite a remote experience because they're so young. But I teach it mainly as a technical exercise in as I say, first the packing of the density of observation, and then the zooming out at the end to the universal statement.
Yeah, it's very interesting teaching Larkin. I wrote an article about Larkin, about my experiences of teaching Larkin, and how it compares to T.S. Eliot, and T.S. Eliot is another poet that you're influenced by as well, I believe.
I don't think so much anymore. I mean, this is a terrible thing to say, but when 20 years ago, I would have thought Eliot was my great mentor. And nowadays, much as I profoundly admire and love Prufrock and The Wasteland, the quartets I think Larkin may refer horribly dismissively to Eliot as book drunk, which is a grotesquely over the top, but I do now find, for better or worse, much of the quartets rather too thinky. I like thinky poetry less and less as I get older. I've just, no doubt because I've been to a lot of funerals in the last few years, I've suddenly, I hope Larkin's shade will appreciate this, fallen in love with Thomas Hardy. I've always liked a few Thomas Hardy poems, of course, but suddenly there I am reading 20 or 30 just sitting. So I'm at a Hardy stage of life, not an Eliot stage at the moment. And in fact, when I read Eliot, I sometimes think, well, don't worry, Tom. William Wordsworth will be along in 100 years. And I think, no, steady on. That's the other way round. So I seem to be personally between the salutariness and the joys and sorrows of the natural man of Wordsworth, and above all the grief of Hardy.
Do you find Thomas Hardy consolatory to read?
Only because someone is saying certain things, and I think, as Larkin says in an interview, to say something negative well is a positive achievement, which I suppose is I quite often shock my students by quoting this be the verse, and at the end almost everyone is laughing. And you say, well, how can you be? He's just suggesting we all kill ourselves as a race, kind of mass self-genocide. How can this be amusing? And the answer is, of course, that, if you can think of a pun as funny as they fuck you up, life ain't that bad.
Yeah, it's funny because T.S. Eliot, when I used to teach it, I found my students quite liked T.S. Eliot very easily. They kind of really took to him. I think they liked him on a sort of superficial level, and I think they liked the kind of imagery and the symbolism.
Are we talking about the kind of Prufrock era of Eliot?
The Wasteland, particularly.
Oh, the Wasteland, right, wow. This is for A-level, presumably.
Yeah. But I found Larkin challenged them more. I think they found Larkin, to really kind of get to grips with Larkin, to get to grips with form in particular. I think at A-level it's hard for them to really kind of get any complexity of that, really. But they found the formal structures of Larkin really difficult. Actually, they find metre and rhyme and understanding how that conveys metre very challenging.
Yeah.
Whereas I think with Eliot, it was for them more about imagery and symbolism, and I think they found that quite easy to grasp. I mean, maybe not a very deep level, but they could sort of see where images that Eliot was throwing at them, and I think they kind of found that quite natural.
That's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, because I do think that the visual bits of the brain are probably more easily lit up, and ever more so in our kind of culture than the auditory ones. And I do think that the auditory imagination, as Eliot called it, is perhaps a bit deficient in this age compared to the visual imagination. And I'm an unashamed fan is too small a word. I think personally, rhythm is biological, or biology is rhythm, or biology is rhythmical. My heart is beating now, and I trust, and that sort of thing. And when I walk regularly. I do like poems that have a good, strong, coherent rhythm. But I think it used to be, of course, quite an ordinary social skill. I was in the Bletchley Park Museum a few years ago, and there was this lovely poem written by somebody who had worked there in the war about how much they didn't like their digs in the village and didn't like their landlady. And it was this very elegant bit of light verse, maybe triqué tetrameter with some very witty rhymes. I sense that 50 or 100 years ago, this is something that a lot more people just did as a kind of, in the same way they could knock up something from a Nigella cookbook. But I think that's largely leaving now. And when people, can't possibly generalise, but I do think poetry is coming to be much more a visual thing in the way you're describing. People expect imagery above all.
Yes.
You can have that. You can have the auditory at the same time. But you have to have a sense of words as individual entities. As a teacher, almost everyone can write, in the sense that you can write a letter or a postcard or an email. But as Clive James said, Larkin's poems aren't so much written as built. The words, but after all the patience and the sieving and the construction, the moving and the rounding, the putting it away for 6 months, these things are pretty indestructible in terms of their structure and their efficiency. And, you're conscious of the individual words, not just the general idea, like blort.
I know when I was talking to James Booth about that, and we were talking about how, if you take a word away from a Larkin poem, the whole thing sort of unravels.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I'm just looking across at Broadcast, which is not a poem I particularly like, but I'm just looking across and you just think organ frowned on, huge I remember liking huge resettling and thinking that was brilliant when I was about 17, or snivel on the violins. These are very precise words. It's amazing how, I just saw the other day in The Spectator that Tom Stoppard was asked, I think, other people he misses, and he says that even, I don't think he knew him, but he misses Larkin. And I think Ian McEwan says that he has this theory that the contemporary novelist imaginations are saturated with the diction of Larkin. It's just extraordinary. Another point I make to my students over and over again, as they go out to maybe 70 or 80 years of writing poems in some cases, that you don't have to write a great deal to have a huge impact. I think the complete number of poems in Less Deceived, Wits and Weddings and High Windows is under 100, I should think. And yet, look at the colossal impact that's had. It's like I've got the irresistible, inappropriate image of the meteor that killed the dinosaurs. But just this huge crater, but a marvellous crater. And some poets, I won't name names, but very good poets, long dead canonical poets, can overwrite and repeat themselves. And Larkin, I so admire the scrupulous way that Larkin doesn't repeat himself. Herbert Read, who I did my thesis on, my doctorate in 20 years ago, he has an essay called What is a Poem? And he had been a guest at an American university, and the philosopher, I don't know whether you pronounce her name Suzanne Langer or Langer, but she had said, so Herbert, what is a poem? And Read had been talking about poetry. She said, no, yes, but what is a poem? And he was initially rather irritated by and thought she was making a specious or captious point. But in fact, there is a difference in poems and poetry. And I think poetry now can be this general idea that we're all supposed to kind of share in and see as a kind of social good, like a kind of nitrogen in the atmosphere or something. But that's not the same as poems, the individual things which get into you or which you carry around in your heart or in your pocket like a handful of coins. I mean, I think of Larkin as he has that late poem about the Brimore Jones Library, doesn't he? In this house, joy, youth and age, in this house, joy, and minting new coin. And his poems, I think, are very like coinage, and they're very distinctive, you know? Toads Revisited is a kind of 20 pence piece, and Broadcast a 50 pence piece. You look at them and they're distinctive.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. James has got a concordance, like a printed concordance. And
what, for Larkin?
Yeah.
I didn't know there was one. Goodness.
I know, because
that's Christmas 2020.
Well, I love concordances anyway, but I've only ever seen them sort of online, really. And James said, "Oh, when you look in the concordance," and I just said, "Oh, is there one?" And he said, "Yes." And he got up and walked off to the bookcase and got it. So, oh my God! Yeah, we started actually talking about use of expletives and swear words. And James has got kind of theories behind that and how it shows Larkin's sort of progressive use of language, etc. But yeah, I think Larkin would only choose very deliberately to use a word more than once, only if you really had to, you know.
I think you're entirely right. And I mean, he does use the F word twice in High Windows, of course, but I suppose,
yes, of course,
but in very different contexts. Yeah.
Very much so. And actually he talks about that because he talks about how you can, you know, different forms of words, past tense and like the ed ending and things like that, and using the same word as a noun or a verb, etc. And even, you know, down to that level, that kind of grammatical level, about how he sort of kept such a tight rein on his language. Do you find you do that in your poetry? Do you find, I use that word, I've used that word before? Or
well, I don't think of it so much with words, but I don't think I have it in me to use words with quite that poignant, severe memorability as individual items. What I do notice is that I've realised in the last week twice that I've written a sort of pastiche elegy of my earlier elegies, and it's always a very nice feeling when you realise, oh, thank goodness, I've already said that. You know, it's nice to think, well, I haven't got to do that work now because I've done it. I can just, mind you, I mean, I'm always happier when there's some writing to be done, but it's also very nice to have little holidays. I mean, at the moment I've got nothing, you know, as of today. Yeah. It's all done and dusted and kind of archived, and that's a nice feeling too, as well as having something to write.
And have you got a new collection of poetry coming out?
Well... 2024 is the aim. I do. I'll tell you something I do have in common with Larkin, just fairly quantifiably, is that I'm very slow to get a collection together. So I'm aiming to do it in 2024, which will be 9 years after The Mortal Man. So I produce about. I worked it out recently. I think I do about a reasonably good line, I hope, a week on average. And I think, well, put that way, it doesn't sound so bad, does it? It's not an okay line of poetry a week. I could live with that.
Yeah, I think Larkin would say that was a good rate. I
do think there's ever more poetry, and perhaps it's harder to find the poems among the poetry, if you see what I mean. If there is, you know, I mean, I have no idea if there is a study of this, but I imagine that in Wordsworth's time, perhaps there's 30 books of poems a year in Britain. I think you could probably read British poetry in the 19th century. You know, no one can read British poetry now, and that's both a good and a perhaps not so good thing if you can't sometimes see the wood from the trees. But we talk about poetry as though there's only one kind of poetry. I no longer enter poetry competitions because I realised after about 2 decades of not winning that they probably didn't quite think a poem was what I thought it was.
I do like the way poetry now does seem more people are writing poetry because they use it as a voice, and I think that's, you know, I think that's really good. That it's not seen as something just for the highbrow.
No, I completely agree with it. I think Larkin's got the classic metaphor for this, which he says that you may not play tennis at Wimbledon, but you very much enjoy playing tennis. It'd be terrible if you had to be published if you had to be one of the great dead of Faber to have written a poem. I mean, anyone can And the pleasure of writing is I get so excited by writing anything that I'm usually in a very good mood all day, and I kind of know it's almost certainly going to be rubbish by tea time. But I don't. If I'm in a good mood, I don't look at it for a few hours, because I just, even though there's only a 5% chance it will in fact be any good, I prefer to feel happy for those extra few hours.
I know when I've been to open mic nights, and some of the quality of the poetry you hear, it's just astonishing. And these people will probably never even submit anything to a competition, And you sometimes hear these absolute gems and think, wow, that was beautiful, it was amazing. I heard a definition of a poet once, I don't know who said this. A poet is someone who spends all morning putting in a comma and spends all afternoon taking it out. Well,
that's right. I'm reminded of the less striking, but it makes the same point story about Yeats. And Yeats was staying with a friend, and he came downstairs after about 12 hours looking like he'd just walked twice around the world, hair even wilder than usual, a broken man. And his friend said, "Well, Willie, did you have a good day?" He said, "Yes, I wrote 2 lines." So yes, and I think it's absolutely brilliant that everyone is writing and enjoying writing to the degree they are. So this poem is about the duplicator, which my father somehow managed to extract from his office in Cavendish Square in London, where he worked in oil. And we had many a happy hour collating minutes and such. Right, the duplicator. My father had a conker-coloured desk, buff envelopes and other jetsam drawn from London, punch cards and account-ruled sheets, and above all a useful duplicator smelling of ink and spirit. A frail stencil was first applied like leaf around the giant tarry drum. A handle turned with great revolutions of the arm made papers airily fall, then stack up in the tray. Orderly duplication of the minutes. Later, hooded like a hawk, it cooled, regained its temper, like a warrior after a day's work, in a zen-like calm among the ashtrays and the dusty pot plants. Cornwall. This is a 2-part poem. The first part takes place in my childhood on a summer holiday with my parents, and the second part 30-odd years later, when my parents had retired to Cornwall. When I refer to Hale in the second part, it is to the town in Cornwall, not the weather. Cornwall. Part 1. Summer holiday, 1978. Each year, the motor caravan wove down to Cornwall with a churn of Cala gas, whose iffy hiss became a perilous crown of blue petals. A treadle worked for trails and coughs of narrow water, and a mass of orange scratchy cushions dense as bales. Safe in its travelling room, we ran by schools of light on water, glittering and begetting. Splay footing with my father round the pools, miniatures of the sea in blue-black rocks. I found strange creatures ready for my netting, near holes of bladderwrack and dabbelocks. A fete we went to had a straight-backed band, dancing that pleased my mother, fancy dress with cups and paperbacks I briefly scanned. A man might idle with their epic themes, love, spies or sharks, beside the waves' excess, while far blue tankers stood like ships in dreams. Each place held kind relations bringing teas, with cliff-shaped cake and dainty cairns of scones. As sands grew chill, devoid of families, we reached our airy site, each cupboard full, like noble savages with all mod cons. For any fool can be uncomfortable. 2. Charity dinner, West Cornwall Golf Club, 2011. In black tie, we are bound for charter night. These headlight-glamoured, mizzling lanes restore primordial summers. Everything feels right. My mother saying neatly, "OK left" at junctions. pockets stocking every door with tissues, juice or sweets. My father's deft and youthful driving. Close to Rose and Grouse, our low car rolls by dark and slivery sea, then gravely crunches to the glowing clubhouse. Stiffly, my parents step. Inside there rise gold names and silver cups for mastery, time and experience roughly amortize. After the meal, before the band, I stray out to the hummock dunes, where reefs of vapour make hail at night look like the Milky Way. A net that drips with light, a host of chances for races, fates, and photos in the paper. I turn, and in the hall my mother dances, waving her arms but staying in her chair. My father beams with pride around the bar, his foot miraculously cured in there. My parents move in light. Here they both are, rarer than Cornwall's gold and silver ore, as past the links tall breakers charge the shore.
Thank you so much to Kieron for giving his time so generously. If you'd like to find out more about Kieron, just Google Kieron Winn poet or go to his website kieronwinn.com, and there you can get hold of a copy of The Mortal Man or have a look at all the different things that Kieron's up to at the moment. Thank you to recent new Twitter followers David Sink, Danger Fourpence, Paul Detman and Durham Wasp. This podcast is produced by Simon Galloway, and the music is The Horns of the Morning by the Mechanicals Band. The best way of supporting our podcast is to become a society member. So if you head over to philiplarkin.com, you can look at how to do that there. Thank you for listening, and if you'd like to be a guest or have any comments, please get in touch.
The horns of the morning are blowing, are shining. The meadow is wet with the coldest of dew.